Well, good afternoon if you are in Illinois in the United States or New York City, where I am. Good evening if you are in London, Paris, Berlin, Milan, Vienna, Salzburg, and just about all the places where my guest appeared today. Uh, and welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to people all over the world. And my guest today is all of that I mentioned and a lot more. Karen Huffstodt, originally from Illinois, but an artist of the world, joins me from her home, and a soprano, also a great teacher. Karen, welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays.
Well, I'm so happy to be here, Fred.
So there's so much that we can and will talk about. Um, you and I are contemporaries, so therefore, many of the people that we worked with, knew, saw as performers, um, are or were in both of our lives. So this is going to be a bit not a walk down memory lane as much as really a documentation of an era from someone, you, who was a great protagonist of it, and me, someone who was, I would say, I worked Epic Grapes in the Opera Vineyard for many years, and I
Ah,
made a lot of wine.
so you
And
know where the bodies are buried, Fred.
no, I don't even
Yeah.
talk about that, although I do. But Karen, how did we know that you're from Illinois? How did you start? When did the opera awakening? When did it hit on your forehead that this is what I'm going to do?
Oh my gosh, very rather late on. I will give you a quick little story about my childhood growing up. My parents were not musicians. I had no idea what opera was. I was always performing as a kid. You know, I would shut myself in the garage and had all these little records and I would have little shows and the first time I remember singing in public was since we are contemporaries, you remember show and tell from kindergarten.
Sure.
And most kids were bringing their Barbies or their toy trucks. And back in the
I
day,
brought in the teeth that fell out of my mouth.
oh well, that's pretty cool too. That's quite cool. I probably did that also, but but anyway, I thought, what should I do? And so my mother was working full time at that point, and I think she felt rather guilty about that. So she'd always bring me back little gifts, and one of the things after work that she would bring, she'd stop at this little store near our house, and they had a lovely kids section, and they had all these little stacks of, I think at that point, oh my gosh, it was toward the very beginning, it was actually 78 RPMs, little
40,
yellow
yeah.
plastic, red plastic recordings. And there was one that I liked in particular and had been working on back in my stage in the garage. And this was Do Re Mi from The Sound of Music. So it was time for show and tell, and Mrs. Yazbek said, Karen, what would you like to do for us? And I said, well, I would like to sing a song. And the wonderful thing about this recording was that it was one of the first karaoke's. There was one
Mhm.
side that had all the text, and the other side had the orchestral accompaniment. So I gave this very, what I thought at that point was fully fleshed out gestures, from top to bottom of Do Re Mi from The Sound of Music. And where did that come from? I don't know. I don't know. And then kindergarten, it was just one of those things. And another quick childhood story, and then we'll get to the transference to opera. But I find these so funny because my family always goes, where did you come from?
Mhm.
But we were doing a Christmas pageant, and all the kids in kindergarten had one little line, and I remember mine distinctly was, I am a Christmas tree. And I apparently didn't think that this was an adequate representation of what I could do. So I did my line, I am a Christmas tree, and then said, and now I will recite the night before Christmas. No one, I didn't tell anyone because, I thought, well, if I tell someone, they might not let me do it. And so I performed the entire thing. Where that came from, I don't know. But anyway,
So one of the early lessons was save it for the stage.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Don't ask if you don't want to get, the wrong
Right.
answer. So I learned that very early on. So anyway, going through childhood, I sang in school, had little solos here and there, did the musicals in high school and really fell in love with musical theater. Got to college, was following in the footsteps of my high school choir director and went to his alma mater, which was Illinois Wesleyan in Central Illinois, very good music education school. And because I was from good Illinois corn-fed stock, we had to have something practical. At that point, I hadn't even seen an opera. And in the summers, I did these little theme park gigs, which were quite fun. Like I sang at Six Flags Over Mid-America. I spent a summer singing in Nashville at Opryland, where my big number was What I Did for Love from Chorus Line. And I had a couple of other Stephen Foster things where I got to use my legit soprano voice. And the music director came up to me wearing his cowboy hat and cowboy boots. And after one of the shows, they were grueling, but it was very fun. We did like 6 shows a day, 6 days a week,
Mhm.
half-hour shows, sort of musical theater kind of review things. And the music director came up to me and he said, Karen, I just want to talk to you. You're doing great. And he said, your partner, Bobby, we can't hear him. I said, what? What do you mean? We were singing a duet of What I Did for Love. And I said, but we're wearing body mics. And he said, we can't hear him. And so, just hold it down a little bit. And he said, another thing I should mention, it's sounding maybe a little operatic. And I thought, oh no, because I thought I had everyone fooled.
Yeah.
Because I knew deep down, I knew I had this legit voice, but for what I was doing, um, I thought I I thought I could fool people, and I loved musical theater, but obviously I was not fooling anyone, and even the people at Opryland. So a couple years down the line, I started looking into this opera thing, decided that I was going to perhaps not teach high school right away, but I was going to get my master's in voice. Really had very little repertoire when I auditioned for schools. I
Just
auditioned for
one
2
question.
schools.
Where did you get your formal training, your technique?
Well, it started at grad school. I
Okay.
went to Northwestern,
Yeah.
and studied with Norman Gilbranson. So it
So,
started there.
just to interject, you and I may have been in Evanston at the very same time.
Are
None of
you
those
kidding
together.
me?
So,
What?
I,
Oh my God.
not to digress to me too much, but my education included 3 places. It included Northwestern University, the University of Wisconsin, but basically I was commuting between Chicago and Evanston. Chicago and Madison for a couple of years, and then Italy, where I did a lot of my upper training. But um, I were contemporaries, so we were probably there very close to the same time. Um,
Oh my, we'll talk about that later. That's
but I was
hysterical.
in the Medill School of Journalism and the School of Speech.
Ah,
Speech
uh,
being their acting at Northwestern.
I actually was an administrative assistant at the School of Speech after I finished my master's for a semester or so.
Okay.
So I mean, who knows how many times our paths have crossed. But anyway, fast forwarding, there I was at Northwestern. For some reason, they heard something because I think I had one aria. I had Quando men vo, and I
Mhm.
auditioned, and they gave me the opera scholarship. And that summer, I was hired. Well, hired. I was an apprentice at Santa Fe, and showed up in Santa Fe. And who was there but my music director from Opryland, who actually was Ted Taylor,
Ah.
believe it or not. And
Mhm.
Ted, for those of you who don't know, is a wonderful, wonderful um, opera coach. And I said,
Yeah.
Ted, I said, do you remember? He was like, oh my God, Karen. He said, so you're singing opera now. And I said, Ted, why didn't you tell me? I was like heartbroken. It was like, oh my gosh, my musical theater career is over. And it was a little traumatic for me for a while. And he said, I figured you'd figure it out.
But
But
also the
there,
lyric was "Kiss today, goodbye, and point me toward tomorrow." That's what he was doing.
exactly, exactly. I never thought of that before. But yeah, my partner actually, Bobby Amarante, went on to do a lot on Broadway. And, but we weren't the best duet partners,
Right.
shall we say. Yeah. So that's how it
Um,
all kind of started. One other thing that really got me going and wet my whistle, so to speak, was that in that same period of time, if you were in Evanston, did you know Monastero's restaurant?
yes. And also, let's talk a little bit about Evanston. Evanston at that time was known as a dry city. In other words, alcoholic beverages could not be purchased there in restaurants and bars. And
Right.
was it Chicago Avenue that divided the city of Chicago?
Yes, and Rogers
And the
Park.
South
Yes.
Side was basically all bars. But I being from New
Yes.
York City, I was not much of a drinker, but I was interested in desserts and ice creams and so on. So I stayed on the north side, and Evanston had all kinds of ice cream parlors and soda fountains, a lot of them, and a
That's
drink called
right.
a phosphate that I had never discovered before. And I became, because in New York we drink what are called egg creams, which is syrup,
Exactly. Yeah.
milk, there's no egg in it, and seltzer, sparkling water, and it's stirred miraculously and it becomes a wonderful drink. But we didn't have phosphates and ice cream sodas and so on. And so I was young and therefore could burn off all those calories. So I would have one of those things every day. And I remember the south side of the Chicago Avenue was basically a bacchanal. It was
Yes, if you
drunken people.
cross the street,
I would stand on the
exactly.
north side licking my ice cream and watching this. And it was
And
kind of like the stereotype of the city of Chicago as being, feisty. I love Chicago, but it's being very, rough and ready and, up for anything. And Evanston, which was the home of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which promoted, I remember I went into their offices to find out what are you doing? She said, we don't want you to drink. I don't. I'm having a phosphate. Oh, good. But there's all kinds of sin happening across Chicago Avenue.
oh, it was a horrible thing.
And that was our
But
university.
pardon me. Yeah,
That was where
exactly.
we went to
Exactly.
school. But I
Exactly.
forget the name of the line, Ravenswood, maybe. It was the brown line on the Chicago subway map that we would leave Evanston and I would get the L, I think it was called, but I called it the subway. And this is what got me to the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And because it went down to the Loop and it was on East Wacker, or if they say Wacker Drive, and
Whacker.
Wacker Drive,
Mhm.
and wonderful theater and wonderful company. And I went a lot, and I ultimately my first opera job was at the Lyric Opera of Chicago. But did you go to the Lyric? Because one of the great opera companies in America, if not the world, was at the end of the public transportation from Evanston.
Exactly. That's where I saw my first professional opera.
Ah,
And it was, let's see, there were two of them. I saw Idomeneo and I
mm-hmm,
saw La Boheme, those were the first sort of pivotal things.
Right.
And I do believe, is it possible? I became a big Carol Neblett fan because
Yes.
she was singing the Musetta, and she
Hmm.
was also singing
Elettra.
Elettra in Idomeneo. And she,
Right.
chewed the scenery, and she was this tall redhead. And I thought,
Gorgeous.
ah,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, so this is musical theater on steroids. So
Yeah.
what? I can do this. And I really related to that. And it was like, wow. But what really happened, um, going back to Monasteros, was this Italian restaurant.
Hmm.
What was her name? One of the faculty members, one of the faculty members was married to one of the Monastero brothers who were from Sicily.
Yeah.
And so she was an opera singer, and they created this competition. So the competition was wonderful. It supported the young artists, and there were, of course, a lot of people from Northwestern in Chicago. Chicago was full of singers. There were so many fantastic singers. And it was a series of, I don't know how many semi-finals there were, but it was a great drawing card for them because everyone would come in. They had free entertainment. We would sing arias, and it was Italian arias and Neapolitan songs, basically. That was the repertoire. And so by the time we finally got to the finals, I won the thing after eating a lot of pasta at Monasteros. And it sent me to, and I had never been out of the United States. I don't think at that point I had ever been on an airplane, to tell you the truth. This is pretty amazing. But it sent me to Florence, Italy, to study at an opera workshop. It was called Villa Schifanoia. That was actually in the hills in
I know
Fiesole.
it incredibly well.
And it was taught by Tito Gobbi.
My goodness, you and we really overlap, Karen. I just got to tell you,
Wow.
I met Tito Gobi. Well, I saw him first in New York, but I met him in Chicago, and he became my teacher. I had
Oh
two
my
teachers. My
God.
first teacher you sang with at the Met, Herman Pry, and my second
Yes.
teacher was Tito Gobi. Yeah,
Unbelievable.
Tito and
Unbelievable.
many, you and I will have to get together for wine and
I
pasta.
know ships that
But
pass in the night. There are many, yeah.
Tito and one of his recipes is in one of my cookbooks. I mean, the last thing he wrote to me. We know that because his wife, Tilda, sent me
Yes.
a note saying, I found this in Tito's typewriter. It's the last thing he wrote. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So anyway, please talk about Tito Gobi, who was to me magnificent.
He was amazing. And at that point, he was there smoking his cigarette the entire time during the entire workshop. But I got up and I sang a little something. And he said, "You will sing Tosca." And I was like, Tosca? Yeah, I mean, I didn't know any of Tosca. So I was like learning by the seat of my pants Tosca. And luckily, I was aware that he had sung with Collis and everything, but not to the point. I mean, right today, I would be terrified. Then I was sort of
Yeah.
young and sort of, ignorance is bliss. And I thought, wow, he's really good. He's really scary as
Yeah.
Scarpia. And I mean, it's just unbelievable to me that I actually sang that duet with him, having no idea what I was doing. I mean, I think I went there with my one Quando Men Vo aria and
Bohem, yeah.
came out as Tosca. But it also opened my eyes to Europe.
Yeah.
And I fell in love. I became an instant Europhile. And, it was like the Wizard of Oz and suddenly going into the Technicolor section, and
But
yeah.
could you then eat Monastero's pasta again after having lived in Florence?
Well, it was pretty good. It
It was
was
pretty good.
pretty good. I mean, they were native Italians and they knew what they
Yeah,
were
I had
doing.
lived in Italy before coming to Chicago or to Evanston, so that I already was sort of spoiled by living in Bologna and Tuscany, and
Yeah,
Monasteros was fine. It's where I went. I agree, and I,
right.
even relatively recently, but but it's different. And I think that I'm making a serious point here is that we in America, for all of our internationalism and exposure to all of these great people from everywhere and all of our wonderful native grown talent, which is phenomenal, um, we have different values in terms of what's good than do different European countries or Asian countries or African countries or South America. And I would say in general that Americans like big. We like big.
I was going to say volume, bigger
Yeah.
is better. Yes.
And in Italy, there's more of a subtlety, believe it or not. And the stereotype of the sort of loud, chaotic Italian really is not my experience.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
but one of the many things I love about your career, and we intersected a lot, not because we knew each other, but because I was traveling and working in a lot of places. And if I spotted you on the roster of a performance, I would go.
Wow.
And
I'm
so
honored.
I've seen you in different places, and we're going to talk specifically about one later on. But for example, I saw you in Genoa,
Yes.
in Salome,
Doing,
right?
I did do Salome in Genoa.
Yeah,
Yes.
because
Yes.
you may not know this, I've lived for more than 30 years in the province of Genoa and wrote a book about it and so on. So
Oh,
that the Carlo Felice was my home theater, and the scary airport was my home airport.
and the pesto. Ah,
The
yes.
pesto is,
Oh,
I'm I'm beyond a pesto file. I wrote a book
ah,
about it. So it's my favorite pasta dish. It's my favorite everything. And just Genoa in general, it's a wonderful place. Um, I don't know if you're on Facebook, but there's actually a group of Genoa lovers called Genova La Superba, the proud.
oh,
And people go on there and they talk in Genoese dialect, or they post recipes, or they give updates on shops. And it's just really about pride in their city. And the detail with which they cover Genova is remarkable because people know, yes, Christopher Columbus was from there. It's a big seaport, but it's a remarkable city. And Wagner said that after seeing Genoa, London and Paris were boring. And I understood what he meant. And when he was beginning to work on the music for the Ring Cycle, he had written the libretto already. He couldn't quite fasten on how to get it. And he traveled a lot in Italy. And when he got to Genova, he began to have these ideas about the music,
wow.
because the Ring Cycle is everything, but it had to start somewhere with a D B flat chord. And it didn't come to in Genoa, but he went out on a boat and the seas were very rocky, and he wound up all the way in La Spezia, about an hour south. And he was dizzy and nauseated, and they took him off the boat and they brought him to a rooming house. I think the address is Via del Prione or Priarone, 145. I went there, and they stretched him out. They gave him, hot compresses and so on. And then he bolted up in bed and he said, I need a pen, I need paper, and he began to write in Liguria, in La Spezia, but born in Genoa, the notes that begin the Ring Cycle.
Well, well,
And
I actually did sing Wagner in Genoa as well.
what
I
did you
I
say?
did Tristan and
Oh,
Isolde.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, yeah. Okay.
Well, what I began to say is one of the things I love about your career, having heard you over decades, is you span the arc of a soprano whose voice began perhaps with Mozart or was given Mozart at the beginning. And
Yes.
I specifically asked you about Carol Neblett because she not only sang the sweet girl roles, but she sang the angry girl roles like Elettra, who is Electra, but in Italian, and similar high temperament. And I remember Carol Neblett and later Carol Vaness singing that role of Elettra and Vitellia in La Clemente di Tito, both of which completely knocked me out. Because Neblett did it with James Levine and Catherine Malfitano in Salzburg, and that was my first time with Clemenza. And I then got to work with her at the Met, and I asked her about that, and she said, that's my Tosca. And she did a lot of Toscas, I remember, because I worked with her. But she said that she worked out her emotional stuff with Elettra and with Vitellia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But the point is that you began with two of the hardest roles, Costanza in the Entführung aus dem Serail, the Abduction from the Seraglium, which is that the hardest soprano aria, Martin aller Arten?
Actually, I loved Martin aller Arten. I think Ich liebte is the most difficult. I mean, for me,
really?
that was the most difficult because Martin aller Arten, actually, I opened my graduate recital at Northwestern with Martin aller Arten because I thought it would warm me up. So that's how crazy I was.
8+ minutes of
That's how crazy I was. And it was like,
music.
what is it, 12 high Ds or something?
Yeah.
I forget. But that had that kind of energy that I could do very easily. And the Ich liebte was a little bit more, you just walk out and it's eggshells and it's that was always much more difficult for me. And though I am very grateful for Constanze, she got me my European debut. I was hired, I think I did, at that point, I was living in New York and with Columbia Artists and did an audition at Columbia Artists for Cologne Opera. I think Michael Hampe was there, a very, very good director. He was there for many, many years. And they hired me to come and sing Constanze. And it was really a turning point for me. And there I was singing in Germany, which was another sort of, and I think that my Constanze was I mean, there was a lot of talk about it because I was such a dramatic Constanze.
Right.
And which one does not hear so often. And that was a wonderful Pinnell production, which was there, which I don't know if you've ever seen it. I mean, it's hysterical with the drawings of the various types of tortures that, I mean, wonderful production.
Because for listeners, what Costanza is describing is all the punishments that can be endured.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Martin aller Arten, we don't know what it sounds pretty cheery.
Every kind of torture.
Yeah, it's every kind of torture.
Yes. And I didn't know, but apparently word got to Peter Diamond, who was the assistant to Barenboim at the Orchestre de Paris at that point. And he came and he was sort of scouting for a new Donna Anna. And I had sung Donna Anna already several times. And he came and saw me and they invited me to come to Paris to audition for Barenboim, for the Barenboim Ponelcyclus. And that was another aha moment when I arrived in Paris. It was like, oh, oh, now I get it. But they hired me.
And just so I know, this was probably at the Opera Bastille, the old Paris opera.
No, this wasn't. This was actually done at Théâtre des Champs-Élysées.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
For listeners, because the new so-called when I say Bastille, I meant to say Garnier, but
no,
the Bastille opened in 1989.
Yes, and that even though, as you probably know, I lived in Paris and so much of my career, Paris is a very important city to me. But the Garnier is the only opera house in Paris that I never sang at.
Really? You sang at
May
Châtelet?
I sang at Châtelet, I sang at Opéra Comique,
Hmm.
Bastille
Wow.
many times, but they weren't doing much opera then. There was like a random piece here or there. It was mostly ballet. It was.
As a matter of fact, now I speak some French, but I did not speak French when I first got to Paris, was working there. And I went to different performances. I was a student. I lived on Rue Saint-Jacques 214, so near the Pantheon. And students in Paris, it's paradise, and you can go to things for free or for very little money. And I went to the Opera Comique and the Champs-Élysées and everywhere. But I only went once to a performance at the Garnier, which is the old Paris Opera, because they were always doing an opera called Relâche, and I'd never heard of Relâche. And my French was not good enough to know that that meant relax or day off. And so I I heard, I think, Marriage of Figaro or something wonderful,
Mhm.
but nonetheless something that they could do in that theater, which is why it did make sense, controversial though it was, to build the Bastille Opera with its wonderful stage. It's questionable auditorium, but it's wonderful stage.
Mhm.
And Paris, to me, is the most complete opera city in the world, not London, New York, Vienna,
Mm.
Milan. It's Paris. There's
Yes.
so many things, and Berlin is great too, but Paris I would rank over Berlin because there's so many venues for many different kinds of opera.
Yes.
Yeah. So Donna Anna is, to me, one of the hardest roles in all of opera. So you sang two of the hardest roles at the very beginning of your Mozart years.
But they
And
suited me. Donna
yeah,
Anna just fit me like a glove. And it's interesting when you look back at careers of dramatic sopranos, many of them sang Donna Anna.
yeah.
Nielsen
Nielsen,
sang Donna Anna.
Sutherland,
Yeah.
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 Martina Arroyo went to bigger
Mm-hmm.
roles, but
Mm-hmm.
Susanna. And did you ever sing Elvira?
No,
Every
no.
soprano I asked who did both Anna and Elvira, every soprano without exception told me they preferred Elvira.
Vocally, I preferred Anna.
Yeah.
I had a possibility to do it. But because Anna was so difficult to cast,
Yeah.
I think I was always cast as the Anna.
Yeah.
And the Elvira just didn't feel as good to me vocally, and I liked sitting up there on
Hmm.
the top, and I loved Non mi dire. It
Yeah.
fit me like a glove, and Orsai chi l'onore was just sort of premonition of things to come, I think. And
Now there's a wonderful moment in that role. There are many, but um, the moment when she recognizes that the commendatore was her father, the person who's been killed was her father. And
mhm,
Mozart did not do it with words, but just with music. And
yes,
he didn't do that very often, where you would have a reaction shot with just orchestral music. And I love that moment,
yes.
all the moments. But when you were working on that, did anyone say to you, Mozart did this for a reason?
Well, luckily early on, Purnell,
Oh, well.
Purnell, he was amazing. Uh, One of my favorite directors
Yeah.
ever. And I'm just sorry that I didn't have the opportunity to do some of, the Salomes and other things with him later on when I transitioned to more dramatic roles. But that's the way he directed it, which made total sense to me because my wonderful opera workshop teacher at Northwestern was a student and protege of Boris Goldovsky, who
Hmm.
also directed from the music, and it was his philosophy that everything was in the score, and that so I just slipped into Pinnell land so easily, and it made so much sense to me. And in fact, Bob Gay at Northwestern used to, and I use this with my students and also my acting singer class. This I teach this, that it is the music, and Collis talked about it all the time too, that basically it's all there. If you listen, the staging is there, the gesture is there. And Punnell, I will never forget him saying he liked his Donna Anna to be quite strong. Sometimes Donna Anna is a little bit, you know, sad the entire evening. But I will never forget, he said, "You are the daughter of the capo of the mafia, and he has been killed, and you want vendetta," and he wanted that. But there was also the vulnerable side. But it was amazing doing it with him. And of course, Barenboim was phenomenal, and liked that, luckily for me, that more Germanic Mozart. So it was a wonderful experience for me. And
Now, every woman I've ever spoken to who has sung Anna, and every production I've worked on, the discussion comes up at the beginning of rehearsals because it's the opening scene.
Mhm.
What Anna and Don Giovanni are doing off stage, and again, brilliant Da Ponte and Mozart, that action happens off stage without being defined for the audience. So
Mhm.
every time I see this opera, whether I work on it, whether I know the artist, whether it's a new artist to me, I wonder what's happening off stage because it sets the tone for the rest of the night. Did you have an idea, and you can share it if you wish, or rather keep it a secret if you want to? Did you have an idea of what was happening with you and the Don off stage that then leads to the killing of her father? And is, to use Freudian terms, is there guilt
Oh,
attached to that, or what did you experience?
well, I think irregardless of what happened, whatever happened awakened something in Anna that she had never experienced before
With Ottavio?
with Ottavio. And then, I mean, like you said, I mean, talk about Freudian. And then she has this experience, and it's like, what was that? And then the father is killed.
Yeah.
And so, her great need, that she doth protest too much.
Yeah.
It's a little over the top. And poor Ottavio, I mean, I don't know if anything ever happened there. He finally wore her down, and she finally agreed to marry him. But we had a wonderful cast. Ferruccio Furlanetto was the Don Giovanni, and I had the marvelous Philip Langridge,
Yeah.
ah,
With
who
Ottavio. Wow.
was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Furlanetto and I are close friends. Simon
Oh
asked me about
gosh,
that.
yeah.
I always say that I know many people in opera, but I only have a few friends who are real friends, and
Mhm.
he and I are friends. Next time we're in touch, I'll ask him.
Oh gosh, yes.
Because I've seen his Giovanni, but I've seen more Leporellos by him lately.
Oh, his Leporello is fantastic
It
too. Yeah,
is, it is.
yeah.
Where I don't
In
do it with
fact,
Samuel Ramey in Salzburg.
mhm.
The Karian conducted. You remember that production?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Um. So, but anyway, Anna could lead. I don't mean vocally, but I mean dramatically, to all kinds of other characters in the operatic repertoire that you could go back to and refer to Anna dramatically only. I'm not talking music at all.
Hmm.
Um, and she might have, I'm not putting words in your mouth. You tell me, did she pop up in other characters you sang?
Well, interestingly enough, and there are certain similarities between Donna Anna and Electra.
Yes, I know.
Is that what you were thinking?
Well, that was one of them.
Lines, you know,
But there's
I
actually another
never.
completely opposite one, but what we were talking about is Salome.
Salome, yes.
Because everything that Anna experiences or not, but feels, is everything that Salome feels, but in her own particular way acts out. and
Yes.
but it's this, to me, I'm not a woman, it's the same root emotion or set of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've ever worked with women on Salome who know Anna, if they've not sung Anna, we always talk about Anna to get to Salome.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to open a lot of doors and windows and air shafts for them as they start understanding a 15-year-old girl who is a princess in her way, a different kind of princess as opposed to a lady, but
Right.
nonetheless a sense of entitlement and position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But talk about Electra, because I agree with you also about Electra completely.
Mm-hmm.
How did Anna lead toward Electra?
Well, I'm just making the realization right now,
Yeah,
but
okay. Yeah.
there is that overriding theme, as Ponell said, vengeance.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of Freudian stuff mixed up in the
And we
vengeance.
should point out that Freud was born May 6th, 1856, and Mozart was born January 1756, so 100 years before
Ah,
rather. And so therefore, when we're talking about Freudian terminology and psychology, all the psychology in Mozart operas that he imbued in his music and that he was inspired by his librettists was pre-Freudian. It
yeah.
was human, and he
But
was
it's all the
human.
same thing. Yeah,
It
yeah.
is. But that's what's so wonderful, because when I work with people and they say, well, this is kind of a Freudian thing. If you're doing Strauss's Electra or some of his other operas, Salome, yes, Freud lived in Vienna in that period when Strauss and Hofmannsthal were working. But Freud did not live in Vienna when Mozart was there and working on Don Giovanni and Le Notte di Figaro in 1786 and 1787.
Hmm.
So I love everything Mozart seemed to understand, but his miracle among many is that if you are super sophisticated and scholarly, you could approach him that way. But if you walk into an opera house, you've never been in an opera house, you could be blown away just the same as a scholar by everything happening on the stage and how immediate it all is. Um, did you, we're talking about roles that are a bit Freudian. Did you ever see Gilda in Rigoletto?
No.
No, okay.
Mm.
Because she's
And had no
another one.
desire to.
Oh, really? Why?
I don't know. She didn't spark my interest. She was
Well, I know that
too.
Tito Gobi was a magnificent Rigoletto, and that's why I thought maybe he ran that past you, although he was pointing you toward Toscan. I get that.
Yeah.
But
No.
Gilda
No.
is one of those roles like Anna that can be played as a simpering little nervous girl or someone who is defiant of her father, defiant of male authority, and leading to different kinds of consequences. But um, it's a role like Anna that's being reevaluated all the time as new
That's
generations of young
interesting.
artists come
Yeah.
along.
No, I
And
just didn't feel that it suited me vocally
I
at
mean,
all.
someone like Lisette Oropesa, Nadine Sierra playing Gilda, she's a lot more defiant than
Yes.
Judith
Yes.
Blagan. So I love Judith Blagan, but or Roberta Peters. It was a different time and a
Hmm.
different approach to psychology and sexuality, and brings up a point that we don't have to underline too much. Opera is always changing, opera is always relevant. And the Gilda of
Words of
60 years
wisdom.
ago or 160 years ago is not the Gilda of now.
Hmm.
So I know, because I know him very well, I work with him a lot, that Plácido Domingo was a presence throughout your career. And he's someone who charted a path of roles that defied expectations or tradition, as did you. Did that ever come up in discussion, or did he point you toward roles that were perhaps not expected, but that he understood would be good roles for you?
Well, I mean, it is interesting because the trajectory of our artistic relationship went, the first time I worked with him was the premiere of Menotti's Goya
Mm-hmm.
at the Washington National Opera.
Wow.
And that was kind of a high, almost dramatic coloratura thing, Queen Maria
Mm-hmm.
Luisa, which
Yep.
was also a little traumatic for me because this was like a big deal. It was right at the beginning of my career. I thought, oh my gosh, Domingo, and it was going to be this world premiere and a PBS broadcast.
Right.
And the original concept was that there were like these two dueling divas, Queen Maria Luisa and the Duchess of Alba. And Duchess of Alba was plagued by, oh gosh, gorgeous, gorgeous woman. It will come to me in a second. Victoria Vergara.
Oh, sure.
Victoria Vergara. And so this was in the 80s when Dynasty was all the rage, and they said, oh, it's going to be like a Dynasty confrontation. And I was like, oh yes. Well, Menotti at that point never got to writing the Dynasty confrontation. And he was writing pages every day. I mean, it was quite an experience. I mean, we were learning music as we were staging it, because we were just
Mm-hmm.
being put in our hand at that moment. But someone, and it was very close to the premiere, I would say a week or so, someone said, well, we need to be more historically accurate. And, Queen Maria Luisa was notoriously unattractive. And part of the story was that Goya's portrait of her was very flattering,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not so, she was not beautiful. So they decided to make me look like the portrait. And I was beside myself. I was just beside myself and I thought, oh no one's ever going to hire me again. And I can remember almost crying when they were fitting me for the prostheses, the
Yeah.
nose and the big neck and the jowls and the eye bags and all of these things. And there was this salt and pepper, horrible. People can go look at the Goya portrait of Queen Maria Luisa. And I, I remember going to talk to Martin Feinstein,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, we were having a conversation. I said, Martin, can you just do something for me? Because they were having little interviews as they were filming. And I said, maybe it would be interesting to show a before and after. Like you can show me before makeup and sort of, the transformation. And he said, I think that's a wonderful idea. So that made me feel better because, before the video, it's a very short little segment, maybe 45 seconds of, before, and then you see the transformation. So yeah, that was quite an experience too.
And for listeners, Martin Feinstein was the head of what was then called Washington Opera. It's now called
Yes,
Washington National Opera.
yes,
Um, you sang Kundry to Plácido's Parsifal,
yes.
which I did attend in Washington,
Oh my goodness.
and
Yeah.
it was pretty wonderful. And so again, Kundry, who is a lower soprano or higher mezzo role, depending who's playing her, is a completely other kind of role from a lot of the other roles we're talking about, unless you disagree. But dramatically, well, talk about Kundry. Who was your Kundry?
I love Kundry because I don't think there is any other role that encompasses the spectrum of the female archetype.
Uh,
She's the crone, the witch, then she's the seductress, and then she's like the redemptive virgin, you know, and just the transformation. I mean, even though, you know, and I always felt so engaged, even though Kundry does not sing much in the first act. There's the big second act, of course, and then the third act, she doesn't sing at all. And
But she
and
washes feet.
she washes feet with her hair. There's that
Yeah,
famous
yeah,
Magdalene moment,
yeah.
and she is redeemed at the end and finally gets to die and stop this horrible existence that she has
Now, what I'm
had.
about to say, I'm really, really, really not making a joke and being naughty or whatever, but I really mean this seriously. Um, Given as you describe Kundry, that she's gone from being a seductress and a temptress to a virgin, is typically something you cannot reverse, but makes me ask, would the seductress in Act Two actually be a virgin? And is she acting from a different impulse than from experience? So she's not Venus and Tannhäuser.
Hmm. I never thought about that.
Because I've always wondered.
I never thought about that. I mean, she wasn't doing that voluntarily. I mean, she
Right.
was forced. She
By
was
Klingsor.
forced to do that by Klingsor.
Yeah.
You know, and it was her job to make sure, you know, and there were all of these flower maidens around who I'm sure would be happy to do the job.
So she's a
I
madam.
never thought about that. Uh,
Well, I've always wondered, and I wanted to
wow.
ask someone who played the role, but I asked Jessie Norman once, and she said, "I haven't an idea." I said, "Okay, Miss Norman." That was it.
I just always assumed that she was not a virgin.
I
However,
know, and that's how she's typically played.
mhm,
And I don't. Oh, I'm not always in a situation where I can ask a performer unless I know her quite well, or I'm working with a scholar on Wagner and who will pick everything apart. But and whether Wagner wrote about that specifically, if he did, I haven't found it. But there are many incongruities throughout opera, and certainly in Wagner, like Sigmund and Sieglinde having a child and all that stuff. But this is one that I've always wondered about because Kundry, as you correctly, in my view, said, begins as sort of a harridan, a witch, a
mhm,
awful person, then transformed under duress into a seductress, and then a virgin. And I've always thought, well, she's like Turandot. She's a virgin
mhm.
from the start. And if you play her that way, her her redemption at the end, because it's not just his redemption, I think it's also her redemption, um, is it's like other Wagnerian characters who die virgins, like Elizabeth and
Yes.
Tannhäuser.
That's a big Wagnerian theme.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Well, now I have something else to think about,
yeah,
Fred.
this is why we
Hmm.
love opera.
Yeah.
But talk about Domingo in terms of his being in my view, a complete artist. He was my guest. My 250th show was in January, and he was my guest.
Yes, I did get to watch it.
Oh,
I
good.
enjoyed it. Yes.
And I worked with him throughout my career. He wrote the foreword to the book I wrote about operas, so there's a connection there, as there was for me also with Pavarotti and Carreras and others of those type. But he is different because of the range of things that he has undertaken as a singer.
Hmm.
And I don't just mean vocal range, but dramatic range and languages, Chinese, not that he speaks
Yes.
Chinese, um, all the European languages, English, um, everything. So to me, he's a bit like a chiseled, faceted diamond, and the light that we shine on him is the reflection we get back. So that,
Hmm.
I know him from certain repertory, but other people may have worked with him in other repertoire. I probably have seen 65 of his 130 plus roles, but 65 is a lot of roles anyway. Alfredo Kraus had about 20 roles.
Yes.
And so just what you learned as a young artist, because we all learned from him in one way or another.
His commitment, his, I have to say, kindness and empathy to everyone. And it wasn't just his colleagues, it was he knew everyone's name. I don't know how he did it. He knew everyone's name
Yeah.
and knew their children's names
Yeah.
and their birthdays and I mean he was just phenomenal at making every person who surrounded him feel important and feel valued, and I thought that was a very, very important lesson.
I'm going to tell a little story about him regarding that because you triggered it.
Hmm.
Um, some people know that I'm very fortunate to have my mother and I take care of her. And when I do these conversations, I hire someone to sit with my mother.
Hmm.
And that person is from a Spanish speaking country. And the day that Domingo and I were originally supposed to record, the Wi-Fi was not working in Madrid. And I had
Oh.
to bring in the person the second time early in the morning the next day so that we could record in time. And Plácido asked me, how does this affect your schedule? And I said, well, I have a
Hmm.
dental appointment, but the woman who takes care of my mom when I'm with my guests will have to come in early. He said, let me talk to her. And I handed her the phone and he spoke to her in Spanish and he thanked her for making it possible for Fred and Plácido to sit down and talk at what was 7 in the morning, New York time,
Hmm.
1 in Madrid. And then he said, and let me talk to your mother. So they spoke. And, you know, that kind of thoughtfulness is not a given. And he realized that his Wi-Fi not working, which happens, impacted other people. And he immediately made sure
Hmm.
to thank the people who were impacted. So and that was January. That was just now,
Yeah.
recently. Um, anyway, you continued in your career where there's a whole lot of career we could cover, but the role evolution went towards Strauss. Now, there are many women like Lisa Della Casa, Kiri Takanawa, Renee Fleming, who called themselves justifiably Mozart Strauss sopranos, but they tend to be the Elviras and
Hmm.
um, the countesses who then go on and do the Marschallins and the Arabellas
Yes.
and so on. But then there's the other kind of Mozart Strauss soprano, like you, who, yes, you did Arabella, but you then basically went from Anna and Costanza to what Martina Royal calls Strauss's big girls. And
Yes.
not their physical size, but their emotional size and
Yes.
the demands of the roles. So Arabella is a role that I absolutely adore. And I think she's undervalued. The Met will be doing it, I believe, coming in November 2025. And it was supposed to have been Lisa Davidson, but she will be on maternity leave. So they're having Rachel Willis Sorensen. It's a beautiful Otto Schenk
Hmm.
production. And
Hmm.
talk about the role of Arabella. I think it's a great role and it's a great opera, and somehow it gets lost in the shuffle.
I loved Arabella. I and I only had the opportunity to do one production. It was in Catania at
Mm,
Teatro Massimo Bellini
yeah, beautiful theater.
with a
Wow.
wonderful German cast. Franz Grundheber was my Mandrika, and it doesn't get better than that.
Yeah.
And just the text, you know, aber der Richtige von einer
Yeah.
gibt für mich. I mean,
The
the
right man.
text.
She
Yes,
knows.
yeah,
It's like from Guys and Dolls. I'll know when my love comes along.
exactly. I've done that role too, by the way.
Okay.
In my musical theater days, yes.
Sarah.
Sarah Brown,
Sarah.
yes, yes.
And it's the
But
same thing. Yeah.
yeah, but she was very A very independent woman. She knew her own mind, you know, she was ahead of her time.
Yeah.
And I really, really, I had an offer later to do it in Vienna, and I was really sorry there was some conflict, so I couldn't do it, and it never happened again. And by that time, I was off and running. The whole transition period happened very quickly. I mean, when I think that, you know, I was singing Traviatas and Donna Annas, and, you know, there was like a short period of time. Well, was actually doing both. And this first Salome, um, I don't know why. I think I'm pretty instinctive. And I heard about this French Salome that had suddenly opened up in Lyon. And as you know, and many of our viewers know, Oscar Wilde actually wrote Salome in French first.
Yes.
It was
Mhm.
originally in French. And so they were, and Strauss then set the French to to his music with a, you know, a few little changes to serve the prosody of the words.
Mhm.
But I was obsessed with doing this. It was originally slated to be Teresa Stratas.
Mm.
And I think she just decided that maybe she didn't want to do it on stage. I mean, she was amazing in the film of
Yeah.
Salome, a wonderful singing actress. Um, and this just after singing Arabella, Strauss was like vocal therapy. You know, it was like, oh,
Mhm.
yes, maybe it's time to stop walking the tightrope of Aki Schliebte and do something that just, I think, is written for my voice. And so I was like a dog with a bone. I wanted
So
to do,
what year would this have been? Do you remember?
um, it would have been, I think it was 1990 or 91, the Salome.
Because I heard you, I remember specifically, I went to your Met debut as
And
Violetta in
that was in
1989.
89. That was in November to
That's why,
89.
because you were saying you went from Violetta to
Oh,
Salome. That's very short order.
I know. I know.
Because you did it that season at the Met, you did Fledermaus, Rosalinda
Yes.
with Herman Pry, which is part of why I was there. But you began as Violetta. And you have people
Yes,
like Neil Chikoff and Cheryl Milnes and Wendy White.
exactly.
A lot of
And I
Illinois
later,
people there. You know that? Cheryl Milnes, Wendy White, and you were all
I
Illinois.
did know that. I did
Neil
know that.
Chikoff being Brooklyn, but that's
And later performances, I got to sing with the wonderful Alfredo Kraus, which was
oh my. Yeah.
amazing,
I've
amazing,
said it publicly, I can say it again. My fairite tenor.
amazing. And
Love
rehearsing with him,
the
he
three
was
guys and Gedda and Vickers, and I love Bergonzi, I love them all. But my favorite tenor was Alfredo Kraus.
he was such a gentleman.
Yeah.
And you know, they always joke about back in the day. Now everyone wears jeans and sweats and everything to rehearsal, but even then, people sort of dressed for rehearsal. And he was in his three-piece suit,
Yep, I know.
impeccably dressed. And when it was time for him to kneel, one of the assistants would come and they would put the cloth down on the ground. I mean, I'd heard about the diva cloth. I had never heard about the tenor cloth. And I will
That's
never
funny.
forget, we later did performances together. And I think this might have been after I had already sung Salome. So I'm coming back to do to Met in the Parks. And it was at
Hmm.
Central Park, and he
Right.
was the tenor.
Oh.
And there was a limo for him. And then there was the bus, you know, for everyone else. He was incensed. He was incensed, and he said, "The prima donna comes with me in my limo." And I was like, oh, oh, such a gentleman,
He
such a
used to, when
gentleman.
he worked at the Met, I got to work with him a lot, especially with Sutherland. And
Uh,
he would arrive with someone bringing his clothing, and he would arrive perfectly dressed, as you described, for before the performance when he came into the stage door. Then he'd get into costume. But the other bag contained another suit for going out in the evening after the performance but to be attired properly for the restaurant that he was going to, that the suit of before was not right for
The daytime suit, yes,
the
the
daytime
yeah.
suit. It's true. He
Oh my
was
goodness.
phenomenal, and his English was pretty good. I spoke to him in Italian mostly because he studied the same teachers, Renato Scotto in Milan. Um, but we used the very formal Italian, the lei, the voi, and
Yeah,
he did that with
yeah.
me. And but Sutherland would speak to him in Australian accented English. And I remember he walked in one day looking impeccable, and she said, "Hello, beauteous man." And and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand."
Ah,
Alfredo, you are so handsome. Oh, no, 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 my lady. It is you. It is you.
oh, oh.
You are handsome. Yes, I am handsome, she
Ah,
said.
oh, that's sweet.
I loved him. As an
Mm,
artist, but also as a man. But as an artist, just since you sang
mm.
with him, talk about his singing.
It was perfect.
Yeah,
Uh,
it really
it was perfect. I mean, there's nothing else to say. It was perfect. And he knew
so
exactly what he was doing. And he'd look at you with those blue eyes and you'd forget everything. And
true. Part of
yeah,
why, and also, seriously, I remember when he was 65, he sang The Duke of Mantua in Rigoletto, and he had a gray mustache, and he was a
yeah,
handsome
dashing.
60-ish man, dashing
Yeah,
man. But, you know, the Duke is supposed to be 26, 27. You completely believed, and not because he was dashing, but his acting, you
yeah,
believed that
yeah,
18-year-old Gilda could fall bonkers in love with this guy
yeah.
just based on his singing. It was
Yes.
remarkable. And also a wonderful colleague, the way he described Plácido was a lot more open and out in the world, whereas Kraus was quote correct. But I was very friendly with Pavarotti, very friendly. And he said to me, "Do they ask you all the time who's the greatest of the three tenors?" I said, 10 times a
Ah,
day. "And what do you answer?" I said, "Alfredo Kraus." He said, "That's correct."
ah,
Because
I
the
never met
film,
Pavarotti, unfortunately.
oh
I never
no,
worked with him. No,
oh, oh,
no.
we'll have to talk
Pity.
about him. If you ever saw the film by Ron Howard, the documentary, I was the consultant on the film because Luciano and I were friends for 29 years. Worked with Plaza a lot. Luciano, remember I said about before Lynette was a friend? Luciano
Yes.
was a friend, yeah.
I,
Domingo was a wonderful colleague.
that
What's the difference?
I couldn't even leave the theater after that film. I, it just touched me
Yeah,
so deeply because
yeah,
it was about being an artist.
yeah,
And I think I have the correct film right. At the end, when he was ill and he was talking to his daughter about,
yeah.
he would never listen to himself sing. And she finally talked him into listening to some recording. And he was like, oh, but I was good. And it broke my heart. I mean, I was with a friend and I was just a puddle in that theater at the end.
It's a beautiful film.
Yeah, it
Um,
really truly is.
you know, because we've communicated a bit before this conversation, that I adored Alfredo Kraus, but my very favorite opera singer of all in my whole career, my whole life, and the person I got to work with her a lot, really a lot. And I just was crazy about her, is someone that you got to work with really a lot. And I'm putting words in your mouth, correct me if you don't agree. She was like an artistic mother to you in a lot of ways, was Leonie Rysanek.
Yes.
And there may have been better voices, and there may have been, she was a gorgeous woman, so it's not that. There may have been other combinations of factors that led other people to prefer other singers, and I completely get that. But my perfect opera singer, even though her voice sometimes failed her, was Leonie Rysanek for all kinds of reasons. When did you first encounter her, either as an audience member or as a colleague?
Well, I had known her recordings, as I was studying, to prepare my first Sieglinde and my first Salome, and I listened to her and I loved her. I mean, I just loved that intense sort of naturalistic thing, that visceral thing that she had. But I really didn't meet her until she was already starting to do her farewells.
Ah,
So the first time I sang with her, I think it was probably maybe 92, 93 at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. And I believe it was the Götz Friedrich production that she had actually sung Chrysothemis in. So I
mhm.
was actually wearing the costume
Oh,
that she had worn. So that was her farewell there. And we got to know each other there. And there was a lot of time, during rehearsals. And she just sort of took me under her wing and was amazing. And and I humbly say, I mean, I couldn't even believe, but she said, we are sister singers. And that makes me want to cry,
yeah.
you know, for Leonie Rysanek to say that to me. And that the evening of the opening, or maybe it was her actually, we did a series. And it may have been the last performance, and she'd always invite me to come to her dressing room. And, we had many dinners, and Elu was there most of the time, who's
Her
delightful.
husband, Ernst Ludwig, known as Elu. Yeah,
Yes,
that was
yes.
fun.
And she had this little sign, a little schild in her dressing room, and it was white wood. It was obviously quite old, and it had black, hand painted German script, and it said "Immer mit der Ruhe,"
Mm,
and she said that, which means, take it easy,
yeah.
always with calm, always be still. And she said, Karen, I look at this before every performance. And she said, and you're like me. And you need to look at this before
Mm.
every performance. And she gave me that.
Oh my goodness.
She gave that to me, and along with another little, it was like a little stuffed, about this big, like two little intertwined teddy bears.
Mm.
And she said, this is also very important. And she said, you have to find someone like Elu, who will be there for you, because this is
Mm.
a very, very difficult career. And, she had told me about her first marriage, and, she really, confided a lot in me. And one of the biggest regrets of my life is that I was on a train from Geneva back to Paris in between some performances that I was doing there. And I had my little sign in a carry-on bag, and I went to the bathroom and someone stole that bag. And there was like nothing in that bag. I mean, there was that in my two little stuffed animals. And had they taken the bag next to it, they could have had my jewelry. They could have had many, many other things of value. And I still, I
Yeah,
think about that to this
I
day. And
hear you. I get that. Mm.
I've even thought of having it like reproduced as
Yeah.
closely as I can, because you can have these little signs made, but immer mit der Ruhe. Ah,
Um, a number of years, we used to have something in America called Opera News Magazine, published by the Metropolitan
of
Opera
course,
Guild.
I know.
It's now been incorporated into British Opera Magazine. But they did an art. I wrote many articles for them, but occasionally I would be either profiled or interviewed. And someone was doing an article about how far would you go to attend an opera performance, and what the assignment was how much would you spend, how much would you give up. To me, the question was how far would you go. I said Salzburg, because we'll get into a bit later how I worked with Leonie, and
Mm,
what built the relationship that led to this absolute, it was not fandom, it was love for the woman,
hmm.
who also was a magnificent artist, but I loved her. I loved him too.
Yes,
Her husband was a wonderful man,
yes.
but I really loved her. And And she knew that, and she accepted the love the way one does, with gratitude and return the love. So to me, it was so obvious that I just said to the journalist, Salzburg. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, when Rysanek was retiring from opera, from life, unfortunately, I knew her last performance would be August 25th, 1996 in Salzburg. So, as you know, I flew all the way from New York to Salzburg, got an expensive hotel, expensive opera ticket, never regretted it, because when I was working in Salzburg in the 80s, I had no money. And there was an Oscar Kokoschka drawing that would have cost about $200 in the 80s. Now, that was a lot of money if you didn't have $200, you were on an opera salary. But I still remember not buying that $200 drawing because I really loved it. So again, with Salzburg, when the possibility to hear Leonie's last performance, not even knowing who else was in the cast, you were in it, Hildegard Behrens was in the cast, a wonderful cast, but I went just for Leonie because I was at two of the great performances of her life at the Met. The first one was February 26, 1984, and I was performance manager. And the Met did something that it very seldom does. They threw a gala in her honor, and she performed from a couple of operas with Peter Hoffman, the late tenor. And she was very nervous, very, very nervous. And the audience was there to love her, but she didn't even know if she was in good voice that night. And the audience really went wild. You don't see audiences go wild for too many other singers that way. I remember with Birgit Nilsson, there would be this sort of thunderous roar. You could have that Hildegard Behrens for Sutherland, but there was something different about a Rysanek audience. It was a bit like a Montreux Caballé audience. They would really be delirious in her presence, but even more so for Caballé was the stunning beauty of her singing. Rysanek was the whole person. And I remember very, very well that when it went quite well as a performance, that she asked me to protect her because she wanted to thank her public, not backstage after the performance, but she would come to the apron, to the edge of the stage where the orchestra pit was, and I was to steady her so that she could reach out and grab all the hands. It was like a mosh pit for opera.
Oh my gosh.
And it lasted about an hour after the performance. And she was completely, in a good way, overwhelmed by all this and emotionally very taken, because it was 1984, so it was not the end of her career.
Right.
Just because the Met honored her and the audience turned out and they were cheering Leonie and banners were being unfurled. And after the performance, and I hope you were talking about the plaque that she gave you and the doll, we had a photo taken that night of the two of us, and it's buried somewhere in my files somewhere, and I wish I could find it. It's a color photo. A lot of my photos from then are black and white. So you see her gorgeous blue eyes, and she's sort of leaning into my shoulder with relief at it having gone well. But the other thing was she always battled physical pain. And at that time, there was only one all-night pharmacy in Manhattan, believe it or not. Now they're everywhere.
Oh my.
But it was on 50th Street and Lexington Avenue. And Elu and I and Leonie got in a taxi, and we went to the all-night pharmacy and picked up the things that she needed, mostly painkillers. And then she was very hungry. And we went to a diner that was on 3rd Avenue and 51st Street and basically ate tuna fish sandwiches at like 4 a.m. And this is how she came down. But she wasn't talking about herself. She was talking about Elu. She was talking about the audience. She was talking about Peter Hoffman, how well he sang. And I was seated across from her in the banquette where we sat. No one else recognized her in this place. And he was this nice Austrian couple with their accent and this American guy, and eating food and talking about people who no one else knew we were talking about them. And it was such a phenomenal night because you could not have invented the kind of demonstration that was shown for her. And when she decided to reach out and touch as many hands as she could, it was beautiful. It was a little scary because I didn't want to drop her and I didn't want her to get hurt because I knew she was in physical pain. But she did it. And then right around the same time, I'd have to look up the date, we were doing Lohengrin and she was singing Ortrud. And Eva Martone was Elsa. And the famous confrontation in the second act, some person at the Metropolitan Opera, who probably wound up being fired, decided to repaint the wall that is up for that scene in black because the lighting was such that we could see the two women better. But the paint did not dry. So Rysanek often was very instinctive and impulsive in her acting, always in character, decided at a certain point she sort of made one of her great Leonie gestures and then slammed her hands against the wall and they kind of stuck and she pulled them away, went like this, looked at her hands like that. And there's a video, if you look at her like this, she pulled her hands down and for the rest of the act, she acted so that no one saw the black paint on her hand. And it was stunning because she was so in the moment that she could do that. And Eva Martone was also very responsive and understood what happened because she saw the handprints on the wall and acted properly accordingly and very excitingly as well. And then it's the only time I've heard Leonie really curse auf Deutsch. She was furious and understandably. But she responded, and by the third act, when there's that wonderful in the last 90 seconds where basically Ortrud is eliminated, at least for the moment, to come back, and Lohengrin has to leave, and Elsa drops over, maybe dies, maybe not. Again, with Wagner, we don't know. And Gottfried transforms from the swan into a little boy. In 90 seconds of amazing music, she did all of that with the clean hands. And again, the audience went wild because some people saw the black hands because of what happened on the wall. But a more instinctive, creative, responsive to every moment with her colleagues, with the orchestra, with her voice and its condition on the night, because sometimes it didn't serve her as much as she would have liked. There was a famous time she did a Tosca and it didn't go well and she apologized to the audience. Did you know that?
No.
He came out and apologized to the audience and cried in front of the audience because she felt that she failed them.
She was very humble and very self-effacing,
Yeah.
And she talked about careers, to me, she said, you're just starting this dramatic journey. She said, she very just offhandedly said, oh, if I was starting now, no one would hire me. No one would hire me. They're looking for this other kind of voice. And she said, I know I'm controversial and whatever. And
well, let's not pretend there are looks issues and so on. She was a very beautiful woman and she was a great actress. And her voice was not the greatest opera voice ever, but she knew how to use it and she knew certain moments in the score. And if she couldn't hit the three notes before, she knew that the money note or the dramatic note or the transformative note, that one she was saving for, and she would always get them.
She taught me that.
Oh, really? Talk about that.
Oh, she taught me that. It was her farewell in Paris, and she was doing Herodias, and I was the Salome, and we had Sitzprobe or something, and she was like, "Nine." She said, "Why are you singing that? No one will hear it. Wait for the high B. Wait for the high B." And then she said, and she taught, and it's a very good tip. She said, and hold it a little bit past the cutoff, just a little bit, so they can't say you held it too long, but which she sometimes did. Yeah. but I loved it. But she said, just hold it a little bit past, so your voice is the last thing that is heard. And It works.
Yeah.
It works.
Um, her Met farewell was January 2nd of 1996. So the same year as her Salzburg ultimate
Hmm.
farewell. And that was as the old Countess and Queen of Spades.
Yes.
And the Yerman, the Herman, was Gegam Gregorian, father of Asmik Gregorian, now a big star. He's no longer with us. Valery
Yes.
Gergiev conducted, and what's her name from Ukraine, a lovely singer. I'll think of her in a second, Maria Guligina. And
Ah.
it was a marvelous cast. And Dmitry Vorostovsky, God bless him, was the baritone. And
Mm.
they all knew that it was a very big night because anyone who studied opera knew that Rysanek and her relationships with the Met audience was very
Hmm.
particular. Even around the world, it was very particular. But also because it was a beautiful production by Elijah Moshinsky. It was a very dramatic production with a lot of physicality required. She had to break out of the floor and be an apparition. She had to die on the stage twice. Um, it's a role where you don't have to have a lot of voice at that point.
Hmm.
There are women who do it with a lot of voice, like Violetta Romana is doing it soon at the Met, and has a lot of voice. But you don't have to. Elizabeth Soderstrom did it at the end of her career.
Hmm.
Regina Resnick, and but I knew something, and I wonder. And now we're going public with something that is known but was not publicly discussed. She was very ill when she was doing these Queen of Spades. And because I was in her confidence and I knew where the pharmacy was, although we had others by then that were open, but she relied on her husband, of course, but also on me and only two or three other people who knew that she was very ill.
I
And
did not know.
you did or you did not?
I did not know.
Okay. Did you know
No.
in Salisbury in August?
She never mentioned it. I mean, I had a feeling something was going on because she canceled several of the earlier performances. I think I don't, did she only do the one or did she do
I
two? She
don't
may
know.
have
I was
done,
at the last one.
yes,
I knew that if she did
she
any,
may have
she'd do the
done,
last one. So that's why
yeah,
I bought that one.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
she had
So,
bone cancer, which is
yeah,
a
I
very
did know that.
painful. No
Yes.
cancer is good, but bone cancer is incredibly painful. And she willed herself into these performances. And
Hmm.
what was so remarkable was that no one would know. You
No.
just
Oh my
wouldn't know.
gosh.
And she didn't want people to know because she wanted to be received as an artist and not as a victim, so to speak. But there were just a few people she relied on just in case there was a problem. And but it exists on YouTube, the curtain calls from that night. A few people filled them.
I know,
And
yes.
she endlessly comes out. They were even longer in Salzburg. I remember that. But the commute home from Salzburg is not as big as it is in New York City. But it was at least 45 minutes of curtain call at the Met.
Hmm.
And she spoke to the audience and she was crying, not out of upset, she was crying at the love that she received.
Hmm.
Because, yes, Marilyn Horne, Leontine Price, a few artists were genuinely loved at the Met, as they should be. But the love that was shown for Leonie Rysanek was just of a different kind. Hildegard Behrens had some of that. And do you know about the Lotte Lehmann ring? Do you know about that?
No,
Lotte
no.
Lehmann was a wonderful
I
German
know, yeah,
soprano,
I,
and she had a ring. And when she retired, she looked around for who would be the artist who most exemplified the artistic virtues that Lotte Lehmann wanted to embody. And she, of course, chose Leonie Rysanek.
wow.
And Rysanek had it. And at a certain point, we spoke, and she said to me, she didn't ask me who I would pick, but she said, I wonder if you think that Hildegard Behrens would be a good pick. And I said, I think it'd be a wonderful pick. So that happened in Salzburg
Oh
at that
my.
time. And Behrens had it and then died too soon, sadly, but left it to Waltraud Meyer. And Waltraud Meyer has now retired. And I always ask myself, I don't know her. I've met her once, but I don't know her.
Mm-hmm.
Whom she would give it to, and I think my inclination would be Carita Matula.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of is the next one in that line. But after
Mm-hmm.
Carita Matula, I don't know if there's anyone in that line. Do you see any singers in the world who sort of follow that all-encompassing artist, singer, actress, life force that was Rysanek, Behrens, Meyer, and Matula? I think opera is changing. It's not no fault of any of the women in the world, but it's just opera is changing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't immediately,
Nothing of that
yeah,
category.
right.
It's a
And
very
I think
unique
also
thing.
because they were apart from Carita Matula, Central Europeans. And there was a certain
Mm-hmm.
art, had Crystal Ludwig been around, it would have gone to Crystal Ludwig in a way. But Waltraud Meyer certainly made sense in picking
Mm-hmm.
up on that line.
I
And
can
I
see
think
that.
Carita
Yes.
Matula is the last one for now. I hope others appear. But talk to me, please. I was an audience member, but you were on stage with Leonie Rysanek for her August 25th, 1996 farewell to opera. And as you now know, and other people know, she had bone cancer and was bravely going through that and had a terrible death, actually,
Mm.
unfortunately. But talk about
Several
that. And
months.
because I remember you on the stage and looking at you and thinking, wow, there she is between Leonie Rysanek and Hildegard Behrens.
I know. I mean, the
Like,
kid
wow.
who wanted to do musical theater back in Illinois.
Here's
Well,
today, goodbye, and swing me
that was
towards
certainly
tomorrow.
musical theater, right?
It was
On
phenomenal.
a
It was just,
very big
it was a
level.
phenomenal performance. And Behrens, who I adored, really knocked it out of the park that night. And you were wonderful,
Oh,
and everyone was wonderful. Was there a sense that you were doing this not only in service to the audience, but to Leonie?
of course.
Circumstance, yeah.
Of course. I didn't know her for that long, but in that very short period of time, as you know, she could take you in. She
Yeah.
was just that kind of, as you say, there was something, she didn't have her own children, but she was very motherly in her own way, in that way she had of caring about others.
To
And
you, and maybe that way to women, and maybe to younger men. To me, she definitely was not motherly. She was, I was a man, but not a man like an
Mhm.
aggressive macho man. I was a man whose shoulder she and whose arm she
Mhm.
could always rely on, and that I had her interest at heart, and I was a solid man, let's put it that way.
Yes,
And not after her money, not after sex,
she
after
could
anything.
trust you. Yeah,
She'd
yeah,
completely trust me. So therefore, it was like a very deep friendship without the
yes,
sex. But it
yeah.
was such a rewarding, deep, wonderful, because she was a very sexy woman. Apart from the blue eyes, which were dazzling, but she also, there was a sexual energy about her. She was Viennese.
She wouldn't have sung that way without that.
No, I
That
mean,
sort
her
of
Sieglinde,
visceral kind of, yeah.
her Sieglinde
Hmm.
was, I've heard better vocally, but the greatest Sieglinde ever, because she understood what that trapped woman was experiencing when she suddenly has a realization that this guy who may save her is her brother, but okay, we're going to have a child. And then she meets Brunhilde, and it's a clear understanding of two women and what they have to do, and that their lives may not end up well for them, but they have to do it for civilization. And
Yes.
you felt all of that without her ever underlining, I'm doing this for civilization. But the complete abandon, which she says, I will save this child, Siegfried, who has not yet been born. And she sings the love music, which is ultimately the
The
music that
Herstes Wunder,
Wagner, and
yeah.
yeah. And, you know, crowds would go, start screaming. There was a performance of Yennefer where she played the Kostelnichka, which was the stepmother, who's a
Oh,
very
yes.
conflicted character, not an evil stepmother. And it was done at Carnegie Hall with Eve Queller conducting opera orchestra of New York and Gabriela Benasheva. And after the great second act, there's supposed to be an intermission. The audience wouldn't leave and were cheering throughout the intermission. And I interviewed Eve Queller a few years ago at NYU, where I teach, and Eve spoke about that they didn't know what to do because we had to go to the bathroom,
Oh,
but she couldn't go because they kept calling out for
oh,
curtain calls, and I wasn't working at Carnegie. I was in the audience, and therefore
oh.
they just had to basically leave the audience to cheer. Leonie went to the bathroom, and they all did apparently. And then when they were ready, they came out and did the third act. And it happened another time before I went to opera, not by much. Leonie's debut, or one of her first performances, was at the Met in The Flying Dutchman with George London. And
Mm.
it was done at that time. I don't know if they did it with intermissions or pauses. Now it's usually done uninterrupted. But after the second act, after Santa's Ballad, Santa's
Hmm.
Creek, the audience wouldn't stop cheering. And they just brought the curtain and the audience stayed and cheered. No one went to the bathroom. No one went to the bars. Because she inspired that level of ecstasy is the only word.
Yeah, it was a visceral thing with
Yeah.
her. Totally visceral. Yeah.
Um, did you see her after that? And when I say after, I mean in days or weeks later after that Salzburg final performance, because she went home to Vienna and was sick.
Do you know I didn't see her, but shortly after that, it must have been maybe a couple of months later, I was doing my first Isolde in Monte Carlo.
Mm,
And I received a call from Elu.
mm,
And I think, and at this point, I mean, I had a feeling, but they had never spoken to me about
yeah.
this. And he called and he said, Leonie wanted to wish you toi toi toi
Oh,
for the first Isolde. And I said, oh, is it possible to talk to her? And he said, you know, she's resting now, but I'll tell her.
yeah.
I'll tell her you said hello. And another real heartbreak is that were you at her were you at her final services? Did you go to her
In Vienna?
in Vienna?
No, I was not.
Yeah, because I was asked to sing at that.
Ah,
And I don't know if it got lost or if I was doing something else and I wasn't informed, but I found out later I didn't know. And my agents never gave me the message. I had no idea,
mm.
which is a pity because I would have loved to have done that for her.
I'm not
So,
particularly a person who visits graves,
mhm.
even of my own relatives. They're there, and God bless them.
Yeah.
um, I was working at the Vienna State Opera in February of 2016, and in in Vienna, there's a wonderful Zentralfriedhof, which is the central
Mhm.
cemetery, and just about everybody but Mahler is buried there, and
Mm.
Mozart. We don't know where Mozart is, but they have a musician section, and Beethoven and Schubert have prominent graves and
Mhm.
so on. But then there's sort of a singer section, and I bought a bunch of flowers and brought her flowers, which I've never done to anyone ever on another
Mhm.
grave anywhere. But I just felt I wanted to and to go talk to her and,
Yeah.
you know, thank her again for I thank Verdi when I'm in Milan. I go visit him. I don't bring flowers. But he's the only other one.
Mhm.
I mean, Wagner I visited when I was in Bayreuth, but I don't go back to visit Wagner's grave. Verdi I
Mhm.
do.
Mhm.
But for reason I just felt I had to go talk to her, and I was the only one. I found it very interesting that Hildegard Behrens, who was a German, lived a lot in New York, had an American husband,
Mhm.
wanted to be buried in Vienna,
Hmm.
which great. I miss her too. She was wonderful and had a lot of what Rysanek had. And when the two of them would be together, because she too, sometimes her voice didn't serve her fully. But when she was on as Electra, as Brunhilde, there was nothing like, as Leonore and Fidelio, there was nothing like that except Leonie.
Yeah.
And she captured the spark in a way. Anything else to say about Wonderful Leonie before we proceed to your teaching career, which is an important.
Oh, I think that's a good place to stop. I mean, she is such and still such an inspiration to me. Yeah.
I feel bad for young people who never can experience her, because on recordings, it's not everything you want. She had to be received live. Even live broadcasts are great, but they're limited by the technology of the time.
Right, right.
But I would invite people to go to YouTube and watch the curtain calls from January 2nd, 1996 in New York, and August 25th, 1996 in Salzburg.
I think all
yes.
three of those performances that I did with her, I believe, are on YouTube. And if you
The complete.
look for the complete Deutsche Oper, which was with Gwyneth Jones.
Yeah.
And then the Paris Opera, which was her Herodias, that was her farewell, and then Salzburg. So if you look up Rysanek Farewell Paris Opera, you should be able to find it.
You are now a highly regarded teacher. And given what my audience around the world has come to learn about you, and what I've come to learn about you, apart from Northwestern University that I didn't know, we share that.
I have a feeling there are more little things
I
we
would
don't
think
know,
so.
Fred.
And people we know in common. But it's not a given that a great singer becomes a great teacher. I've seen both. I've seen occasionally an okay singer become a fabulous teacher. I've seen wonderful singers like Marilyn Horne and Martina Arroyo become great teachers. And I've seen wonderful singers become not great teachers, and I'm not going to name them. But how is this wonderful but intangible thing that is opera, despite scenery, costumes, lighting, people singing and playing musical instruments? There's something intangible that maybe we touched on a bit about Rysanek, but how is this transmitted, especially in a time when mores, when sexual identities and so on are changing, and I think for the better, frankly, and more open and more inclusive and embracing, and that's how it should be. But some of the tension, the electricity, the unspoken aspects of the psyche that are part of opera, that, as we said earlier, we hear in the music. Donna Anna, going back to her, it's not in the words, it's in the music. How do you transmit that to a singer, especially if she or he or they don't have the emotional makeup? Never mind, they could have great voices. If they don't have the life experience or the, I'm going to say emotional makeup because that's a nice embracing term. How do you do that?
Well, I go back to Bob Gay at Northwestern and his relationship to Boris Goldovsky. It was anchored in my brain also from Jean-Pierre Ponel, but basically everything is there for you in the music. Bob Gay, he was an amazing character. He had sort of this drawl, and he worked a lot with Goldovsky's opera company, and his studio, the opera studio, was covered with Mickey Mouse posters, Mickey Mouse Plotkin. He had a Mickey Mouse watch and little figurines. And finally, we were like, Bob, what is this Mickey Mouse thing? And he had this slow, like Southern grin, and he said, well, Mickey Mouse is my favorite singing actor. And we said, really? Really? And he said, watch Fantasia. Watch Fantasia in that amazing old Disney animation, which I think was the best,
Mhm.
the best. And it's like The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and the music is just coming from Mickey Mouse. And he said, that is your job as a singing actor.
And he was all ears.
That's true. That's true. That had a very high voice too. But yes.
A
But anyway,
countertenor.
pardon me.
Was a countertenor.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So basically, that's it. I feel like there is a missing link, and it's sort of a passion of mine to help singers now, like, make this transition from studio to stage. Because and there were so many fantastic voices, so many fantastic voices. There's still people go, every generation people go, there are no great voices. Yes, there
Yeah,
are.
they were great
There
voices.
there are fantastic voices, but I feel like there is a missing link, and it's how and and I do think that it is teachable in a way. I do think that you can instill, you can give them, I actually now call it, when I teach, I call it Mickey Mouse.
Hmm.
If I need someone to do something and there's this interlude, like Donna Anna's interlude when she discovers it's Mickey Mouse,
Hmm.
and it just makes total sense. But it also, there's a certain way that you walk on stage. There is a certain attitude, you have to have, if you're going to be hired, you have to have this gravitas that the minute you walk on stage, I think it's interesting when I started thinking about this and starting to want to teach it. I thought there has to be a way to sort of express this to people and to help them. Um, I kept looking for it, in the world of theater, in the world of music. Nothing is written about it. I found this book. It's called Executive Presence, written by, and of course I will forget the author right now, but Executive Presence, written by a woman who happens to be an opera fan, but she's in the corporate world.
Hmm.
And she uses, in the first chapter of the book, she talks about some competition that's happening in New York, and how various people walk out, and immediately before the person even performs who the winner is going to be.
Yeah.
And so, and she says there's been so much research done in the corporate world, not in the performance world. They realize that they're CEOs, that they need this gravitas. They want people to invest money, and they've got to walk out there, and you have to be willing to invest money. And, as singers, people have to be willing to invest money
Mhm.
and to hire us. So basically, corporate world has said you have 7 seconds.
I've
7 seconds.
I've taught in law firms to young lawyers, to businesses, to young executives,
Have you?
the so-called art of listening,
Uh-huh.
because I believe a big part of what you're talking about, I certainly agree with, but would add that we don't know how to listen in our society. And it's getting worse because we
Hmm.
have our devices and so on. You and I have had a conversation, we've listened to each other, and we've picked up on what the other has said, and maybe didn't
Hmm.
reply immediately, but later on brought back a topic because
Right.
it relates to everything we've been talking about. But the art of listening is gone. So I take people to the opera and have them listen. I turn off the projected titles and we
Hmm.
just listen, and then we talk about what we've experienced. And by the end, it may not be the same thing that they've experienced, but it's the same production. And then it
Yeah.
becomes about perception. That one person may have noticed the sound of the soprano, someone else her costume, someone else the scenery, someone else the lighting, someone else the champagne at the bar at the intermission. And
Mm.
becomes a collective experience. And working in corporations and law firms and in law trials and in medicine, where
Wow.
you have to take cues from a patient who may not be able to reveal because of fear or whatever incompetence, able to reveal what's going on.
Mhm.
And the arts in general, but opera in particular, does all of that. And I don't know many teachers who put that front and center, and I know that you do, which is part of why I wanted to ask you. But you also teach the art of singing.
I certainly do.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I sort of fell into. I have to give credit where credit is due. I moved back to the United States, and David Jones had been on my radar. I had read some of his articles and thought, oh, this sounds interesting. This makes sense to me. And I liked how clearly he expressed vocal technique. I'd had wonderful teacher in Munich, Josef Leubel, who was quite good. But when I moved back to New York, I thought, well, and it was just sort of synchronistic that I happened to notice that he was giving one of his vocal master classes, his teaching mentorship things that he did every so often. And it was like the next day. And I thought, well, I'm going to go. I'm going to go. And I sort of sat in the back, and I thought, oh my God. I mean, it like blew me away how clear it was and how quickly he could diagnose. And I thought, well, I'm going to study with this man. So I went up afterwards and I said, very kind of shy, "Oh, could we set up some lessons?" Well, I think the first things I said to him were, "David, where have you been all my life?"
Yeah.
And he was like, on 94th Street. I've been here. And so I started working with him, and he's really phenomenal,
Yeah.
really phenomenal. And after we were working for a while, he said, maybe you should consider teaching this. I said, David, when am I going to learn all of this? You have so much knowledge. And he said, no, you have this kind of diagnostic mind. He said, I know you can do this. And so I guess he had an inquiry at one of the schools where I still teach, Lehigh University, from the head of the vocal department. And he was looking, he had someone drop out in the middle of the semester. And he said, I need a teacher. Can you recommend someone? And he recommended me. And I was like, what do I do? I had done master classes and taught a few voice lessons, but I hadn't really been teaching, not since grad school.
Yeah.
But so I went to this interview and had a couple of little sort of guinea pig students, and they watched me teach, and they hired me. So thank you, David. I mean, he sort of said, okay, sink or swim, here you go, but he had this feeling that I could do it. And I still attend every seminar he ever gives. I mean, I met him in 2012 and I've been to every one because I believe that the teaching of singing, you can't read it you can't learn it from a vocal pedagogy book. You have to observe it. And you have to be like an apprentice. You have to go watch, and you have to see work with different kinds of singers, and learn different approaches. And the other thing about David, which I think is very important and which is part of my teaching philosophy, is that you're not just teaching a voice, you are teaching a person. And I think, as artists, I think, I don't know, you see many singers who aren't, who retire and maybe aren't, I don't know how to say this nicely, but I believe that this studio needs to be a safe place, and it needs to be a positive place. Because if you are at all uptight, if a little kid goes to touch a hot stove and
Yeah.
you slap the kid is going to And that's where we feel it, right here.
Woke up.
Right
Yep.
here now in our throat, and that's not going to be conducive to singing well.
Yep.
So, boy, I'm getting all choked up even talking about it.
And I was about to say to
it.
you, if memory serves, we have to conclude now because you have another appointment.
That's true. I do.
And
I
we
do.
had a brief interruption with the Wi-Fi, but that has been addressed.
Well, I could maybe go a little longer if you would want, but we can stop now as well.
Well,
If
what
there's
did I
something,
leave out that you would have addressed?
Oh, well, there maybe we didn't talk about Muti. We didn't talk about La Vista.
Muti. Okay. You did La Vestale at La Scala.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's Spontini?
Spontini.
Yes, okay.
And the previous time that it had been performed at La Scala was in 1954 on December 7th, opening night, as well by Maria Callas. And I just found this like a week ago, and I thought that this was something that I had to share. And then we'll talk about Muti. First of all, Muti is a magician. Muti is Mickey Mouse, with the wand, only, it's amazing. One rises, they always say people rise to the level of your expectations. And he expected that. He demanded that. And one did. And I mean, there were tempos, there were things I thought I could never sing it like this. And he would just be there, and you would. And I can remember that night, there's a funny story. I don't usually tell this story, but Fred, you're like the Barbara Walters of opera interviewers.
What's your favorite tweet?
People probably tell you stories that they normally wouldn't tell, right?
True, yes.
So we're not a few years after, to make a long story short, as you probably know, with Muti, often he would double cast. And were you at La Scala during the time? Did you ever work with him or?
I worked for Robato before.
Okay.
But I was present during a production that Muti was working on of La Forza del Destino, where he triple cast the soprano, and they sat there as if on a bench waiting to be called in for a soccer game.
Oh, yes.
And yes. Soprano, he pointed, "You're on tonight."
Oh, well, it wasn't that way, but I can remember it looked pretty close. But as we were rehearsing, we would go into this, and it was a horrible room. It was a conference room with heavy drapery and carpet, and he'd have all his musical rehearsals there. Excuse me. A little tickly. And that's what it was. You had to constantly be ready. And he would say, you and you. And then he'd switch partners, you and you, you and you and you. And it was like, and for whatever reason, at that point in my life, I sort of it was like a challenge. It was like, okay, all right, I can do this. And to make a long story short, I got opening night. And apparently not everyone was terrifically happy that that was the choice. And I went back to La Scala a few years later, and as Sieglinde, with Muti conducting Die Walküre, with Plácido singing Siegmund, and Bob Kettleson. Did you know Bob? Wonderful Bob Kettleson, who was Muti's assistant for many years. We went out to lunch and we were talking, and he said, "Oh, Karen, I guess I don't know if I should tell you this." And I said, "Well, he said, well, enough time has gone by. He said, yes, during the opening of La Scala, it came to Muti's attention that someone had hired a witch in Napoli to put a curse on you for opening night. And Muti sent someone to Napoli to pay off the witch to reverse the curse.
Yep.
And looking back to opening night, I was wondering why, because he was so defiantly protective, and we would take curtain calls and he would walk down. It was like, I dare you. I dare you. And there were no boos. I
Yep.
mean, he willed no one to boo. But I mean, I think that's hysterical. And I think this is maybe a good way to close the evening, because you have many boxes, as I do, of memorabilia. And I found this the other day. And this rather daunting photo of Maria Callas, who had sung it 40 years before I did, was hanging in the soprano dressing room. And I kept looking at it and going, ooh, ooh, ooh. And my last performance, Muti told me to take it because on the back is the program
Wow.
from her performance in 1954.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was rather frightening there
That's
in
a
the
real
dressing
thing
room.
in southern Italy. It's
Yeah.
called il malocchio.
Yes.
And I once went to the ceremony, let's call it, in which it was in the town of Larino in Molise, which is deep, deep rural southern Italy.
Yeah.
And it was a woman, supposedly the women who are best at removing the malocchio, the evil eye, are women who have borne twins. And what you do is you take a bowl of water, you put olive oil in the water, and you cut it, and in such a way that if it forms little individual globules, the curse has been broken. If it remains together as oil, you've not broken the curse. So then you have to bring in another woman with stronger powers. And yes, they would get paid money to remove the malocchio. And because in the case that I attended, it was a young man who had migraine headaches, and she removed the malocchio. And I asked the young man after, did it work? And he said, I'm telling her it will because I can't go through this again. And I hope that he cured him, but he said it was too scary. It was very scary. But
Oh
this
my
woman,
gosh.
recite all kinds of prayers and beads and bells and cutting the oil in the water. And so, yes, it was someone in Naples that I believe Muti would have commissioned that. That's credible to me in the screen.
I love that story. I
Yeah,
just
I do too.
think it's
So,
amazing.
Karen Huffstodt, this was wonderful, and I hope that we do more, and then we'll get together.
Yes, yes. Who knew we had so many things in common?
But we are contemporaries, so therefore,
Yeah.
I call it planet opera. That we all live on the
Planet
same
opera.
planet we work on, and sometimes we cross paths, and sometimes we know of many people. And as I said, I had seen you perform, but I never had the occasion to meet you or talk to you. But I knew that we had many people in common, and some I didn't know we had in common in places and so forth. And I encourage people who really want to become good singers to go study with you, because you got what it takes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think it's an important thing. It's like just, I feel that we need to pass just as Leonie said, no, hold the high B a little longer. Just that little,
No,
yes,
the intangibles that can only be
yes.
passed on through knowledge and not written down. It doesn't work the same way.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be
Exactly.
tramandato, handed over directly. So, Karen Huffstodt, thank you very much. And thank you for joining me on Fred Plotkin on Fridays on a Dutch.
It has been my pleasure, Fred. Thank you.